As we think of nature, and I live and spend most of my time in Colorado, where nature is evidence of God's handiwork, many people, Christians and non-Christians, and find it absolutely inconceivable that the extraordinary complexity and clear appearance of design in the cosmos could be the result of random chance and blind accident. And I'm curious, how have apologists from Aristotle to people like Philip Johnson and the intelligent design movement, how have they shown that the stunning complexity of our world and of nature just cannot be accounted for by a simple chain of material causes and effects?
Let's step back. Okay, what does intelligent design mean? What it means is that there are all sorts of structures in our universe, including in ourselves on a microbiological level. There are all sorts of structures that point to intelligent design. They could not have gotten there simply by a random system of changes and mutations. That what we see in our universe points to an intelligent designer. It was designed, and there must be some that when we look in the world, there's not just matter and energy. There's matter and energy and information. And the only source of real information that we know of is intelligent design. Now, let's start in a little bit more fun way, because I want to argue, as many of the ID people have, the intelligent design people have, that all the secular scientists actually use intelligent design all the time. And let me give you a real simple example. If you are an anthropologist, and of course you can be a Christian anthropologist, but most anthropologists until very recently have been absolute secular humanists, okay? I mean, just like sociology and psychology, until very, very recently we've been taking those disciplines back. But traditionally, anthropologists, who study ancient man, usually are very, very secular humanists. Now, if you're that, you can start studying an area, right? And you might find a bone here or this there or a piece of rock and whatnot, and you look at it and you can tell right away that it's just random. Weathering caused it to look like that, right? But then you find certain bones or certain flint stones that have clearly been shaped and given a cutting edge. And as a scientist, you can immediately distinguish what is there by chance and the forces of evolutionary weathering and what was actually designed by human creatures. They know, right? If you're a sociologist, anthropologist, you can tell the difference between a bunch of stones that have somehow randomly arranged themselves in a circle. You could tell the difference between that and Stonehenge. When you see Stonehenge, you immediately know that this structure has been intelligently designed. Now, you might not know who did it, right? They used to think it was the Druids. Now they think it's actually much, much older than the Druids. But you immediately recognize, if you're going through South Dakota and you look up at the side of a cliff and you see something that roughly looks like a nose and a lip, you can immediately say, oh, that's just weathering. That's just what happens randomly. But then you turn a corner and you see a mountain that has four heads on it, and you recognize those four heads as belonging to four presidents that you've studied in school, and you immediately recognize that Mount Rushmore was intelligently designed and didn't just happen, right? Here's my favorite example, Larry. Again, if you're a little bit of a nerd like you and I, we all know that Carl Sagan started something that all the geeky boys like. It's called SETI. Do you remember what SETI stands
Sure,
for, Larry?
Search for Extraterrestrial
Yeah,
Intelligence.
you know. See, it's great. All the guys know this, right? The search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And what was Carl Sagan doing? He was scouring the universe for any sign of intelligence. And you know what? If he found something like, I don't know, a quasar beating out the prime numbers, he would immediately recognize, whoa, there is intelligence. This must point to aliens, right? So when you set up something like SETI, you can distinguish between random things in the universe and something that's designed. So all science knows how to do it. But then suddenly, when you come to our world and you look inside the human being and you find all of our cells have this microscopic strand of something called DNA that is programmed with more information than any 10 supercomputers, right? An absolutely clear example of intelligent design. And what do you say? It's just random, okay? Random events cannot create information. Because the DNA, even as Bill Gates, people like that, they look at the DNA and they realize it's been programmed. Okay? And yet, suddenly, when we are presented with overwhelming evidence of design, then we jump back and say, oh, it's just random. And actually, I'm talking too much here, but let me prove to you, by the way, that Richard Dawkins knows intelligent design. Okay? There's a wonderful documentary called Expelled with Ben Stein. And in Expelled, Ben Stein, with wonderful humor, tries to show how any scientist these days that tries to practice intelligent design is going to be attacked by the secular community. And at the end, he has a debate with Richard Dawkins. And he starts asking Richard Dawkins what we're talking about right now. How is it possible that the DNA, so front-loaded with information, how can it possibly evolve? What is your answer? And Richard Dawkins says, well, it could have happened like this. Aliens could have seeded the earth with DNA. Of course, those aliens must themselves have evolved by some kind of Darwinian means. Okay, now, a lot of people that watch Expelled jumped on that and said, oh, Ben Stein tricked Richard Dawkins into saying that. He didn't trick Richard Dawkins. If anybody ever reads The God Delusion, about 2/3 of the way through the book, he makes that very argument. It's called panspermia. It's the idea that aliens seeded our DNA. And do you know who came up with that idea? It was not Richard Dawkins that came up with the idea of panspermia. It was a guy named Crick, as in Watson and Crick, the two guys that discovered the double helix organization scheme of the DNA. Now, Crick was an atheist, just like Sagan, just like Richard Dawkins, but he knew that the DNA could not have been evolved, and so he suggested that aliens did it. And so what you need to understand is that Richard Dawkins believes in intelligent design. He looks at the DNA, he recognizes it could not have evolved, it must have been designed by intelligence, but because God is off the table, he thinks it's okay to say aliens.
Yeah, I think one of the points that we don't want lost here is that people today too often succumb to the illusion that many of today's debates are new, when in fact they're at least centuries and sometimes millennia old.
Yeah.
And we don't want serious Christians, thinking Christians, to be unaware that many of these debates were effectively lost by atheists, and that their arguments today are just digging up these desiccated old corpses. Well, Lou, it's been a more than a pleasure. I'd say it's been an education. And on behalf of our listeners and Hank and the crew here at CRI, thanks to you, really not just for joining us, but for the decades that you've invested in research, writing, teaching, and your willingness to share the fruits of your labors with those of us genuinely wanting to love God with all our minds.